Helium is a critical component in some medical services, but also the creation of semiconductors as a cooling agent. How much trouble are we in?
Well, this was the black swan event that we were kind of concerned about. 33% of the world's supply of helium is gone. And we've had shortages over the past 20 years with the demand of semiconductors going up for many applications. Everything from our national defense to your cell phones that are in your hands. Right? We don't have ramp-up capacity just to make helium. Yeah, it's a pretty scary thing.
Is there a replacement for it? Can you use argon? Can you use hydrogen? That doesn't always end well.
No, you don't want to use hydrogen. The Hindenburg used hydrogen because the U.S. wouldn't sell it helium. No, don't use it in party balloons. Please don't do that. But there's no substitute. You can't use nitrogen or oxygen or anything like that for MRIs. You can't use it in the process of the manufacturing of the semiconductors. Again, no substitute for it.
Wow.
So this is critical enough, Cliff, that you found yourself at the Pentagon yesterday. Are they asking you for help?
Yeah. So they're obviously looking at it very closely. It's extremely critical to our national defense. Everything from munitions manufacturing to the chips that go into the F-15s and the Patriot missile systems. If we don't have helium, we don't have that industry.
When you were in D.C., did you have a bit of I told you so moment? Because the U.S. sold its helium reserve in 2024 to a foreign entity, and I understand you advised the government against doing that.
Yeah, a lot of us in the industry advised the government against it, but there was a congressional mandate for it to sell, and so they had to sell it. And that strategic reserve, which we called cliffside in the industry, was kind of the flywheel for the U.S. So if ExxonMobil went down in LaBarge, right, for maintenance, you still had cliffside going to keep things pretty stable and smooth. But that is no longer the case. The U.S. doesn't have a strategic reserve anymore, but China and Russia do.
Wow.
The U.S. is the biggest producer in the world still, right?
Yes.
And there aren't many of us. It's the U.S., Qatar, we already mentioned, Algeria, and Russia. Why so few?
It's expensive,
yeah,
and it's complex, and you got to find the right resource deposit to make it happen. Most helium that's produced today is associated with natural gas, so I would say about 98% of all helium produced in the world is from LNG, right? Algeria, LNG, Poland, LNG, Qatar, LNG, LaBarge and Wyoming, LNG. Very few pure play helium exploration and production folks are out there. So yeah.
From your vantage point, what supply disruptions are you already seeing? Because we talked about chips. How long do you think it's going to take these disruptions to really be felt by average consumers, not industrial consumers? We were reading a former Nintendo sales lead says that Switch 2 prices might spike because of helium prices.
Yeah, consumer electronics are going to suffer pretty quickly. Europe's already feeling the shortages from this Qatar issue. Asia is going to be out there trying to compete for those spot molecules. The U.S. is resource rich, but we don't have additional ramp-up capacity. We actually have a concentration risk in the United States with our helium supply.
Is that something you were pressing the government to address? Should there be a bigger capacity to ramp up? Should there be bigger production capacity in the U.S.?
Yes, a lot of us in the industry have been talking with the federal government for years, right, to put it back on the critical minerals list. And for reasons that's a long discussion, right? It was pulled off a few years back. But one line item in that, a single critical point of failure, right? It's one of the inclusions for making it a critical mineral. And if we have LaBarge go down, right, now we're 60% of the world's supply of helium is gone, and then we're in real trouble, right?
So let's talk prices. We spend so much time looking at crude oil. Bring us into your world. If we've seen prices double already since Qatar shut things down, where could this go if we have a strait that's closed for many more weeks? What's the equivalent of $200 for a barrel of oil when you're buying helium?
Yeah, so you're talking $2 a foot.
Yeah.
We saw
Is
this.
that coming?
Oh, that's definitely coming. We just don't have any additional volumes to move around out there. So the allocations.
The quantity is by feet?
Yeah, we MCF, MMCF,
Okay.
right? We go by cubic feet.
I learned something new today. All right,
Yeah,
got it.
I like cubic feet. It's an easier number to handle, right?
Yeah.
But if I went back to 1991, I would say the price of helium was 5 cents per cubic foot, right? Per standard cubic foot. Coming out of the last shortage, we were starting to settle down around 38 cents to 48 cents per standard cubic feet. And then at the height of the last shortage, we were up to $2.50 a foot.
Wow.
So that's pretty high.
You've seen these numbers before,
Yes.
and we're going back to the highs, is what you
We're
would
definitely going
expect.
back to the highs. We already see the allocation letters that are out there. The force majeure has been declared by at least one, Air Liquide.
Yeah.
There's more to follow, I'm sure, right? So yeah.
So how did you leave this meeting at the Pentagon? Were there solutions on the table?
They are definitely working on this, right?
Yeah.
They're definitely taking a second look at this, and I think they're definitely listening to industry leaders about this. What do we need to do? Do we need to build more liquefier, capacity? Do we need to look at helping junior explorers along that are out there, right? Protecting them against, the low prices that Russia may try to flood the market to disrupt our potential for building new production.
Mm-hmm.
So we've been talking a lot about Artemis and the space trip, and that requires helium.
Yep.
Apparently that spaceship used $1.5 million worth of helium to launch. So this is not just about chips and capacity now. This
Yep.
is about the future of space exploration.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. It used $1.5 million worth of helium. And when we think about all the launches that SpaceX is doing and Blue Origins and the European Space Agency, Russia, India, they need helium to launch rockets, right? We need helium to put the satellites in space, right, for your Starlink.
Yeah.
So if you're at risk with your helium supply, it's definitely going to disrupt your launch cadence, right? So if you're planning 200 launches for the year with this type of disruption, you could most potentially be having that number.
It's amazing what you can take for granted until there's a shortage.
100%. All right, so it's complicated. It's hard to produce. Are there any short-term solutions to patch this gap as we try to remedy whatever's going on in the Middle East?
There's no short-term solutions other than the producers or the explorers that are out there that are trying to get new production online.
Yeah.
That is probably our nearest to term, but you're talking anywhere from 6 to 16 months to get a new plant, like a regular gaseous plant for helium. You could probably get put into place in about 6 months if you find the deposit.
Okay.
To refine, right? But then to get to 5-9's helium, which is liquid helium, and the cryogenic state of it, those liquefiers take 16 months to build, $50 million.
You just wonder where policymakers have been on all of this. We had a CHIPS Act that brought domestic manufacturing of semiconductors to the fore, and this is something we talk about in Washington every day, how we have to rely less on other nations. We talk about the NVIDIAs, the Broadcoms, the Taiwan semiconductors of the world, but none of that is possible without helium. Should there be a congressional answer to this? Do we need to revive the reserve?
I think so. I really do.
Why isn't it happening?
Well, I think this administration is definitely taking more steps than the last one did.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to be agnostic here.
That's
right?
fair enough. We appreciate that here at
The last
Bloomberg. Yeah.
administration was behind the CHIPS Act, too. You would think that
They were
that would
behind
have
the
been
CHIPS Act, yes.
a more urgent
Yeah, I'm
priority.
confused how this has flown under the radar so
Yeah.
long because
Yeah.
I feel like we've talked about critical minerals, we've talked about chips,
That's
we've
right.
talked about single point failures, and this only now, in my mind, and we're pretty into the news, has really come into the conversation.
Yeah. I always like to say helium is, the Lord of the Rings reference where it's one ring that rules them all, right? So even when we talk about, the rare earth minerals, right? Even to get those processed, right? And we have a problem with processing in this country. We don't have any, right? So even if we find the minerals, we don't have the processing
process them,
capability,
yeah.
right? And in that process, right, when they're in the labs and they're testing to make sure those minerals get to the high purities that we need for production and for uses, you need helium for that. Right? So if you don't have helium, you don't have our electronics. You don't have aerospace. You don't have your Nintendo Switches, right? So.
I don't have a Nintendo Switch, but I know people who would be very upset by that.
But you got a cell phone.
I have multiple cell phones. I don't even want to get into that. All right, so what should countries do? I mean, should governments prioritize? Should there be rationing? Should they say, I'm assuming we're not getting party balloons anytime in the near future, but what do you do when you have a limited amount and a lot of mouths to feed?
Well, rationing would be a really touchy subject. I guess, you have to enact the War Powers Act for something like that, because it's now all privatized, but
What would you like to see governments do?
I would like for them to actually take it serious. You know, instead of just saying, well, we've got plenty of supply this year, but next year we have, you know, a shortage.
Yeah.
And then that just blunts our growth anyway. You know, when you look at semiconductor companies and all these folks that use helium in their manufacturing process, fiber optic cables, right? They can't, you know, project and look at growing their business if there's no stable supply of helium. You know, how are we going to have a stable AI growth if we don't have helium?
Yeah.
Right. And we have competitors out there. We have adversaries out there, Russia and China, that definitely recognize that it is critical. When you look at the Amur processing facility in Russia, which they just brought online, the Russians built the Vostochny Cosmodrome right next door to it. Right. That's their new space program. That is, you know, they want helium right next to their space program. We don't really have that here.
So we've identified the problem. If the strait were to reopen, there's an expectation, for instance, energy prices would plummet. Would the same happen to helium, and could you end up with a glut?
No, because the plant was damaged.
Got it.
Right, and we don't have a cessation of
So
hostilities.
reopening the strait is not it. You need to fix that plant, and that could take years.
Qatar Energy said it themselves, 3 to 5 years at least.